Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Ryan Dividock. I'm the supervisor for the Planning, Zoning, and Land Use Unit within the Planning and Local Business Development Division in Oakland County. Welcome to today's virtual planners gathering, Regulating Home Occupations. Just a few reminders, the meeting is being recorded and it will be available on our website. And if you have any questions, please use the chat function in Zoom and send your questions to Jim Schaefer. Jim will moderate a question and answer session after the presentations have concluded. So let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. We have Caitlyn Habben with, she's a professional planner with Weight Trim. And from Ferndale, we have Liz Sackley, who's a code enforcement officer and rental inspector. And we also have Melissa Kalmasi, a planner with the city of Ferndale. So thank you all for joining us today. Caitlyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us today. One of the things with home occupations, as a topic that we were asked to kind of present about, is it's changed quite a bit since COVID. So a lot of us traditionally were thinking you have your hair salon. In our rural areas, sometimes somebody wants to be a small time mechanic where they specifically focus on like classic car rehabilitation or working on cars. You can have people working out of their office as far as a tax accountant or things of that nature. But COVID really changed some of the work dynamics for people in which they started pursuing a side hustle and then it became their more full-time business. You have a lot of people that went hybrid or fully remote, which is, and for most communities, not necessarily their home occupation threshold. But we see that there's sometimes a push to be back or hybrid schedules. And so that's one of our main reasons for topic today. So next slide. And so one of the things, if you're reevaluating what your requirements would be, really do a soul search of your community. What makes sense for your community? Is it regulating those who are doing a piano tutoring session? Is it the landscaper where they have 3, 4 trailers or teams that are coming out of their house? Is it the Tupperware parties where you have that somewhat regular occurrence back in the day? And so that's one of the things if you're evaluating home occupation regulation, think about who are you trying to regulate, and that might help you with a home occupation review. Next slide. So one of the first places starts is your definition. And so I pulled in a common definitions for a lot of our home occupations or home-based businesses. Usually you always see the terminology extent, it's incidental, it's secondary to a dwelling unit. The primary purpose is that it's a single family resident and you're in those zoning districts. And so you want to make sure that is the primary use. As soon as you start getting too overly commercialized or office, that's when you need to refine. We're happy for your success, but relocate to that appropriate district that can handle that intensity or those potential nuisances. Ferndale's my partners today presenting, and so this is their definition of talking about home-based businesses. And so they use some of that same different language, talking about accessory uses, talking about making sure they're incidental, subordinate, but they also include some regulations that are requirements. And so check your definition section to see is there requirements in there. So for theirs, they have some outdoor sale limitations, so you don't have the perpetual yard sale kind of retail component to that home business that's not necessarily appropriate for that district. Next slide. So in a rural application, for some of those individuals that work in those communities, you have your agricultural zoning district, typically abbreviated AG, that you allow this in. Wherever you allow a single family home, you typically allow home occupations. There can be different thresholds associated with residential uses. And so it's really common language to see it. It's a secondary to this residential, so it has to be smaller. Some say specifically 25% as a threshold. And we'll get into that in a little bit later, why some communities choose to do that or don't choose to do that. You always include typically a component that says no noise, odor, fire, traffic. That's not typical within a residential or rural area. Looking at that nuisance to your surrounding neighbors and trying to protect them. Looking at your retail products made on site. And so some of these different home occupations, when you're saying, well, tell me a little bit more about your operation so I can make sure I classify you properly. That's usually one of our main distinctions is, am I becoming a roadside stand, which is under the Right to Farm Act, in which you're making product, 50% of it's made on site, either from your strawberries that you make jams out of, or different products. That's different. That's typically roadside stands are different in the row as opposed to being part of a home occupation. As opposed to somebody that says, well, I'm a salon and sometimes I sell my products that I use. Or sometimes you'll have somebody say, well, I make these things, but then I also buy these tchotchkes from Amazon and sell them for this profit. Well, hold on, that's more retail, and that's not something that's as permissible as a home occupation. And so when you're having those preliminary discussions to help classify someone, teasing out those questions can sometimes be helpful in making sure not only you as the regulator, but them as the applicant understand where the thresholds are. And then parking always being located on site, wherever that may be. Next slide. So one of the things that's really common in rural or your suburban kind of settings, and it can vary greatly, is the classification of home occupations as a type 1 or type 2. Type 1s can be that you're only allowed to be in the building where that single family dwelling is, and others let you expand to a barn. So we've had inquiries with people that are dog trainers. And so the dog trainer, it makes more sense that you have that in your accessory barn. And for some communities, that's no problem. We'll regulate accordingly, as opposed to a hair salon. That's typically something that's happening in the building. Outdoor storage is another component. So when you have your landscaper establishments out of their home, maybe they have two teams, so they have two trailers with a bunch of um, mowers and blowers, and maybe they have some light amount of mulch on site. For some communities, that's okay in a residential setting, and others that isn't. Some of it is, but you need to have screening requirements so then nobody can see it, or controls on their hours of operation, things of that nature, in which you evaluate, does that make sense under a type 1 or a type 2? Another common component that differentiates the intensity between 1 and 2 is your employees that live on site or are part of the on site. In our rule applications, sometimes you'll see language not just saying that they have to live on site, but they'll say they have to be part of the family. Others say you can include staff members that aren't part of the family. And so just look at your zoning ordinance, make sure you look and see what level of regulation you want to enforce as part of it, but it's a common indicator. And between number 1 and number 2, it's also the approval process. So you can have an administrative process so it doesn't go to the planning commission. You can have it be more permitted process, but still requires planning commission review and approval. Or you can have it be a special land use, SLU, or it can be a conditional use approval or things of that nature requiring a public notice. So those within 300 feet that own or occupy are notified, and then it's also put in the newspaper. So type 1, type 2 is a nice way that you can talk about intensities, and home occupations is meant as an umbrella term. It can include a lot of different applications, and so sometimes just teasing out what level of nuisance is okay where and to what extent is helpful when you're regulating. Next slide. Some of the trends I'm seeing when you're looking at your rule application and people asking or looking at their zoning ordinance amendments is they're looking at making the process easier. For those uses that used to be permitted or a special land use, they've kind of thought about, well, if it's a hair salon in someone's house and we know these are the frequency, we know these are the hours of operation, they only have one chair, we can really have that be administrative, thinking of people's time, money, and effort. That's something that some communities have really started dialing back, is that they've been able to regulate to find a compliance situation as opposed to over-regulate. One of the other things that communities are evaluating as part of the primary caregivers, the marijuana discussion that happened several years ago, is we had electrical compliance permits, or as part of your home occupation, you pulled them in as primary caregivers. So some communities are reevaluating those requirements, saying, do we really want a dog in this fight? Or are you seeing less and less of these requests in which the need to regulate those is necessary? So for some of our members, you might recall there being requirements for satellites in your front yard. So there used to be those 5-foot discs We're seeing communities extract those because it's kind of, it had a time when we needed it, and we're not really seeing it be needed again. And so we can have that same conversation for some communities with primary caregivers. Is that still an active component? Is that an active complaint that we are monitoring, in which we want to change our regulation to not overregulate, but regulate to the extent we need it? Other things I'm seeing communities remove or they don't like policing is the number of employees. So when I mention the language that says they have to live on site or they have to be part of the family or you can only have this many number of employees, the comparison is counting chickens. Do you want to be sitting there counting chickens? Do you want to be sitting or talking to somebody and arguing if that's a family member and then going through the sob story of, well, there's not enough like family people to be able to run this business and I'm a farm practice. And so if you don't like having those conversations, pull out the requirements and try to regulate a different way. You can still regulate the number of employees, but are you worried about it being on-site or off-site? As long as there's no more than 6 cars, is that getting to the compliance you need? The other thing is for those communities that allow outdoor storage, is the screening appropriate? Either your baseline requirement screening, or also just if you're going to have outdoor storage, making sure those are applied accordingly for a residential feel or a commercial feel, and making sure that that's really clear to the applicant. These are required trees that you are proposing to plant, or the fence has to also meet our fencing requirements. You can't just throw it up, to hopefully encourage compliance throughout. Next slide. And I'll hand it over to Melissa.
Thank you, Caitlyn. So to offer a bit of a different perspective, we have provided the City of Ferndale's urban standards for home-based businesses. So you can see that standard language that Caitlyn referenced in the definition section of this presentation. We do reference the fact that a home-based business must be clearly incidental and subordinate to the residential use of the dwelling unit. We do have several standards that are specified. We do have a maximum of the number of employees, and that is one non-residential employee. We have prohibitions on whether merchandise can be sold on premises, as well as the outdoor activities. So really, the home-based business should be functioning within the residence that it is that it's occurring in. From the same perspective there, there's a limit to the number of deliveries, and the use cannot impact the traffic, parking, or circulation within that neighborhood that is located within. And there is another prohibition that non-residential exterior building alterations cannot occur. One additional thing is in some of those rural applications that Caitlyn had referenced, those are regulated, but from an urban perspective, we do have limited resources. And so we have issues where there's like limited staff or limited funding opportunities. And so we're stretched in other ways. And so we don't technically require an application or permit for these types of uses. So we are really operating in more of a complaint-based response. And so Liz will be taking that on later on in the presentation, but that's just something to keep in mind.
So other common urban requirements is, again, you limit the number of home occupations on site. Usually when I see that, there's a story for that community, why there's a limit of 3 home occupations on site. But I've seen that in different urban applications. You have your different shipping and receiving hours, depending on how strict you want those or feel up to policing those. Merchandise, as she mentioned, are you limiting it to manufactured on site? So those hobby type components, that's clearly something they can sell out of their home, or things of that nature, making sure it's clear when you can do that. So this language is specifically pulled out of a zoning ordinance, and I highly recommend the best way to explain something is sometimes to provide examples. So if you're making changes, you say, well, I'm trying to describe X. Well, then say, for example, and list out that example. It makes it easier for an applicant to understand what's going on, makes it clear as a organization and different people interpreting it within your planning staff over turnover, what are you saying this is okay and this is not okay? So examples are really helpful to put in restrictions if it's a little bit harder to say these are okay, these are not. The other thing to keep in mind is that some home occupations, because it is an umbrella term, communities are okay with there being instructions. So some of them are, it's a fine arts class, and sometimes they do specific classes within their home on how to do watercolor painting. And so you have 10, 12 people at an event show up. And so ask that as part of your intake, is this something you're doing and how does that relate to your regulation? For some communities, they do require a permit, and so some require annual review of those permits. Others say this is a compliance-based situation. I don't need you to file a permit, but if you become an issue, you have to meet these requirements. And so just evaluate based on your administrative overhead what method really makes the most sense for you. Next slide. As you're reviewing regulations, these are kind of the 5 rules and regulations to live by. So that help you kind of deduce, should we be making a change or should we not be making a change? The first one is talking about similar uses should be treated similarly. And that's kind of a common sense or legal perspective. You want to ensure that when you're looking at bed and breakfasts, which are essentially a more intense home occupation because you require someone to live there and then cater to guests overnight with a certain number of rooms, is that similar to other types of home occupations that you're doing? You look at only write a rule the municipality is willing and able to enforce equally. So if you're looking at county of employees, if you're looking at wanting to allow somebody to sell X product out of their home because they're making it, well, then make sure that you're writing those rules in which you're happy to do that. Or is the rule in place for a very specific person or a horror story? And so if those are the cases, see if that's something that still perpetuates in which you need to have that rule, or is that kind of solved itself? And so reevaluating that. Consider reasonable regulation that can be applied to all properties in the zoning district. One of the main things we want to do is minimize variances. Everyone has the right to apply for a variance for restrictions. And so we're trying to make sure that when you put these regulations together, making sure that it generally applies. Do you want to make sure these type of uses can be a permitted use, or these kind of uses can be a special land use? The piano lessons I mentioned earlier, or the hair salon in your house. Those are things that, do we want them to have a permit or do we not? And so that can help you kind of evaluate what kind of changes you're looking at. And then make sure you're balancing regulation that upholds private property rights, but then balances the surrounding property owners to minimize nuisances. That's one of the main reasons we have zoning where we say this is a residential district. You are not going to be next to all of a sudden a auto repair shop that's using their different mechanical equipment at 7 in the morning. There's a general expectation in a single family district or in that neighborhood. This is the noise level that I should be accustomed to. And so evaluate your requirements to say what's protecting, what would people minimize, deal with from that hazard standpoint? Or when do you think it makes sense to have it be a special land use? So that way the neighbors have a chance to provide input associated with that specific home occupation. The more intense that occupation is, the more likely it should be a special land use, or maybe it's not appropriate for that district. Next slide. So we're going to talk about a little bit of some horror stories, maneuverability, and should check with my consultant. But in general, it goes back to enforcement. Next slide. And so one of the things that happens with some of these home occupations is we typically talk about other licenses in association with our municipal requirements that need to be followed through. From a record keeping standpoint, we always want to keep a copy of those approvals happening. So there are LAR licenses typically for automotive dealers is typo there, sorry about that, and wholesalers, in which they require you to sign off on their paperwork to say, yes, this is a permitted use. And so it's a little bit of one of those, I permit this, but I want the approval from Laura still. And then they send that back to you. Hair salons, body art, so tattoos, those are different things that require a LAR license, and I want a record of that. Real estate agents require their different licenses You have your child and adult care facilities. In the state and legislation, they're allowed to have density requirements, so you don't have multiple child cares within 100 feet of each other. It's a larger setback between those uses. And so requiring those different applications can be really helpful to make sure you're vetting, does your community require any other license? You're not allowed to have that home occupation. Most of us, if you have that as a stipulation, you don't mean to not let someone have a chair out of their home for a hair salon, or those daycare facilities are usually a separate row. And are you treating them similar to other home occupations? The other thing that comes up is you have the oddball for firearms or ammo or parts of firearms. And so one of the nice things is you typically are not alone in this discussion. Get to know individuals from other departments, so your fire department, your police, your building official, who are really used to dealing with those other codes. Anything that goes boom in a residential setting probably should be of concern for fire and police. So make sure that you're looking at those key factors when you're evaluating, is a home occupation appropriate? Is it within the dwelling unit? Fire officials have always told me we do not allow any explosives in a dwelling unit. And so if your community allows it to be an accessory building, again, you still need to go back to your fire official and verify that's still in a residential zone, which isn't allowed. They need to find a more appropriate space. Hit my animation. So that's where it's important to have your cross-departmental review. Um, as you're training your different staff, if you're not the one that directly intakes these specific inquiries from the public, sometimes it's helpful to say, so if anything's explosive, if it's part of firearms, that's when you should circle back and check with everyone else. Or if they mention other state agencies, it's always okay to say, let me look into that and I will get back to you, associated with all the different type of uses and unique things people ask you on a day-to-day basis. Can I do this? Or it's a catch me if you can game, in which you're saying, where do we allow this if we do allow it, to give them a path forward to compliance or not. Next slide. So where the wild things are, I would say the most common home occupation struggles are dealing with outdoor storage and outdoor display. And so it's really helpful to, in your requirements, streamline these as best as possible. Good actors, there are several, but we remember the worst, of course. If you write it out, someone is more likely to be in compliance. And so that's really what we typically strive for. You're allowed to have this amount of area. Is it gross floor area in the home, in the garage, outside? Is that tied to the application and is it clear? Can you see it? So for some of my rural clients, they said, well, if I can't see it, I'm not as worried about it. Okay, that's a policy choice. And so what kind of screening is acceptable? Is landscaping okay? There's a fence required to help with some other dampening. And then where in the yard is it allowed? Don't forget to make sure it's clear that this can only be in the rear yard or this can only be in the side yard. And if it is a special land use, that could be a condition that this cannot expand beyond the rear yard. If you don't have those requirements already written in your zoning ordinance, and you can always make sure these are questions you're always going to ask. You can write those notes and make sure you're trying to be consistent over time until you do several text amendments. Outdoor display is one of those other things. If you do allow merchandise to be sold on site, that's one of those things that you say, what yard is it allowed in if it's in display? For a lot of them, they want to be in the front yard if they allow outdoor display of their merchandise. And so what size is okay? What medium of showing their products is okay? So the key is to be consistent. And so when you have it specifically written in your zoning ordinance, it's easier to be consistent because it says it shall not exceed 50 square feet. And so that's really helpful. You want to make sure it's key when you're interpreting the requirements as somebody that's sat in the office as a zoning administrator, trying to vet out someone's dreams and ambitions. You want to make sure you're being consistent with them and making sure they understand these are the limits, these are the rules, play within this box, or you need to do option B. And then the other part is enforcement. It's always one of those things, well, my neighbor over there did X. That's great. We can't talk about neighbor X right now. We're talking about neighbor U. And so that's one of those things that the more you're consistent, the more you can do those different things, it's easier to say, look, we're resetting and we're talking about you. This is the rule. Are you violating the rule? Yes. Okay. These are the options to solve and get into compliance. So next slide. So this is one of the outdoor displays that we've worked with at one of my different firms, in which, so you can see in the bottom portion of the picture, there's a bunch of different lines and things of that nature. And then during nice weather, they display their tie-dye art and products for sale. And so for some communities, that's, oh, that is a lot going on that would be considered too distractive next to a road. Or not aesthetically pleasing or consistent with the character, since we don't allow people to hang their laundry out in the front yard. And so one of those things is make sure you evaluate your community's level of appropriateness. And so for some communities, you're out in the country and this isn't a problem if this is what you choose to do with your property. And others, this would be on a smaller scale, would be okay. And some communities, absolutely no, this is not okay. And so it's about evaluating those different options that are there. Next slide. So with enforcement and policy setting, generally there's the two different types. You have your regular inspection, so that's your systematic proof of patrolling neighborhoods. So the positive of that is that we are showing an appearance of more equal enforcement. Sorry about that. As opposed to your cons, it's a higher administrative cost. It's a higher demand of staff time. For bigger jurisdictions, sometimes you have better fish to fry than the availability to patrol those. Then you have compliance-based or complaint-based, in which you are waiting for somebody to say something, either anonymously or by name, and make sure whatever that policy is, it's very clearly written. So that way, anonymously, it goes through everything. It could be an innocent neighbor that just said, hey, look, we've had enough of this. Or it can be your rivalry in which they don't mind putting their name down, and this is just another lawsuit waiting to happen between those two neighbors, or another thing to argue about. So pros of that is you have your lower administrative costs, less time consuming because you're only evaluating the things that are there. Or and you have your cons, where sometimes you may not be aware of all these issues farther down the street because their neighbors don't mind. And so you could potentially have unequal enforcement. But either way, go ahead and flash that back there. You're involved in neighbor feuds. And so that's always a fun situation. It does require inspections that are required by staff. So usually a drive-by or something on site, and we'll get into that in a little bit more later. And enforcement may be a long road. It depends on what your procedures are and your community's policy towards enforcement, on which you choose what level of involvement makes sense. As enforcement bodies, you do have your rules and regulations, but we do have some discretion to say, how far are we willing to take this complaint? Are we willing to go full legal court action over this situation? Or is this something that we're willing to say, hey, they're a willing participant, they acknowledge it's wrong, but we can't, they need 2 months to figure their storage situation out or to relocate. As long as they're doing due diligence, let's give them some discretion. But again, you're evaluating it, they're still going through their process if anyone was to follow back up. So then we have our next slide, and I'll hand it over to Liz.
Okay, so when it comes to home businesses, our enforcement is typically we enforce it based on complaints. So there are 3 ways that people can complain. They can come to City Hall and talk to the administrative staff. They can call us on the phone, or we also have this application, C-Click Fix, which residents can access on our website, and they can post anonymously, or they can post with their name. It's up to them. And we then in turn can go look and see what all the complaints are. Next. So we receive the complaint. When we receive a complaint, our process is to get the complaint, and then we go and make sure that it's a problem. When it comes to home-based businesses, it's a hard thing to prove because of our regulations. We don't, you can only have one. We only go with 1 employee, no signage, no deliveries. but someone might say, hey, my neighbor is running a scrapyard out of their yard. And what we can focus on is, do we see a whole bunch of scrap, which Caitlyn mentioned, outdoor storage. So if we see a whole bunch of outdoor storage, then that's what we focus on. So then we start recording it in our program that we use for maintaining our records, which is BSNA. And this is how it looks when you put in a new record in BSNA. As you can see, this particular property had a bunch of code enforcement action there. And this is one of our horror story houses that constantly has outdoor storage issues. So we just keep track of it that way. So we will identify the problem and we put it in BSNA, and then, you know, we do an inspection. We hopefully we can see the problem because we can't just walk onto someone's property and without permission. So we usually ask for permission from a neighbor or something to be able to go onto the property. We document, and then if it's a major situation, a big situation, we might take photos. If it's something that we can actually see from the outside, for example, then we probably won't take photos. So we will usually leave a door tag the first time we go over there. If we don't hear back from them, we'll send a letter. And if we don't hear back from them, then that's when we'll take the next steps, which would be writing tickets and sending, you know, you can do a first ticket, a second ticket, a third ticket is a court appearance. Hopefully in that time period, they end up contacting us back so that we can come up with a plan for compliance. Because that's all we're looking for is really compliance. None of us want to waste our time going to court.
So here's an example of what a home occupation might look like if it's in compliance. Really, it could be just any of these homes on a residential, in a residential neighborhood. They would not be impacting the external conditions of the home. And so we theoretically wouldn't even know that a home occupation is taking place within these basements or within these structures. If you can move on to the next slide, please. And on the flip side, home occupations that could potentially be in violation. You know, in both of these situations, we might get someone who complains that there is a violation, you know, that there's a salon happening in someone's basement and that they're causing a high amount of traffic, or there's some nuisance being generated that's impacting the neighborhood that it's located within. So we've displayed the picture that was on the previous slide because sometimes there could be a complaint, and again, it really isn't impacting the external. It could just be some sort of neighbor feud that is
yes. Usually
that's
it's a neighbor feud. When it comes to something like a hair salon, we had a situation where we had a hair salon complaint, but the house basically looked like this because the neighbors are fighting with each other. When we went over there was no traffic concern. There was one space for one person to get their hair cut. One employee was a person who lived there, and that was it. So that's an example of a neighbor dispute. And the second one, oops, that's okay.
So I guess we can move on to questions. I guess one final thing that we would say is, again, going back to the two pictures, that sometimes things look like the home occupation is completely within the structure. Again, from a city perspective, we wouldn't even know that there's an issue there until someone called us out. And then again, we verify whether or not that issue is something that we can enforce and refer back to the ordinance to gain compliance with the ordinance. And sometimes we do have situations where it is something that we can verify from the street and we can have a quicker path towards resolution. So with that being said, I think we can move on.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for the presentations. Just as a reminder, if folks have questions, just send them to me in the chat. First question, would Ferndale allow that tie-dye display home occupation?
We wouldn't allow it to be an occupation as far as selling. If somebody was not selling them, they were just displaying them as decoration, then we would allow that. But if people were coming to their house to purchase, we would consider that a retail business, and we don't allow that.
Okay. For Ferndale, the slide seemed to indicate that it's okay to have a single food truck on a single family lot. Do you allow food trucks in single family?
One food truck, but they don't operate out of the food truck on their single family lot. They just park the vehicle there.
Okay, so for clarification, that's a storage
Yeah,
allowance, not a sale allowance.
exactly.
Okay. Would air, and this is for any one of the three of you, or all three, do Airbnbs equal home occupations in your various communities?
We regulate Airbnbs. We don't consider it a home occupation. So just like we have a rental like for single family homes and duplexes, and then we have a separate ordinance for short-term rentals. So they're limited to the amount of Airbnbs that can be on one street, but we don't consider it a home occupation.
Okay,
Yep.
Caitlin?
And I would echo that. Most of my communities is a separate use, partly because it has more transient individuals, and you have the tendency to potentially be a party house if it's only really being utilized on the weekends. And so the potential nuisance is higher. So most of my communities say we're going to regulate that separately. One thing you'll look for is sometimes in the older codes, you'll have rooming houses. Different things of that nature. So some of those older terms where you could have one room for rent. Um, a lot of our communities for Airbnbs, that's not what they're asking for. They're asking for the whole house to be rented. But you could potentially say that if it's one room, is it similar to a bed and breakfast? If they're operating on site and renting a room, that might be the more appropriate classification without having kind of splitting nuisances on, do you provide toast as part of your breakfast meal as part of that?
We only allow rooms for rent if the owner lives in the house. So we don't allow like a house that rents out different rooms unless the owner lives there. And I don't think we have any space for bed and breakfast anyway. We're pretty dense.
But that's not considered a home occupation. You regulate that differently.
We
But
just
and
it's very vague, I will say, but the rule literally just says if the owner lives in the house and they rent out a room, then okay. If the owner doesn't live there, then they can't do it. They can't
Okay.
rent out.
Same, I guess, follow-up or same question, daycare. Are daycares similar in that they're regulated separately, or do some communities consider those home occupations as well?
For our city, we rely heavily on state and other requirements. So we generally would allow them within the home. But again, we'd refer back to those like overarching standards.
Okay, Caitlin?
yes, usually it's a standalone use, partly because there is the state statutory associated with that. And then they are a different level of nuisance. So 8 kids running around between the ages of under 5, that can have some nuisances. They have very clear pickup and drop off times sometimes. And so that's why a lot of communities still itemize it out separate. And that's why it's important to treat similar uses similarly. Just keep in mind, how do we play with these other communities?
Okay. Question on how do home occupation regulations apply to an urban farming situation? For example, roadside stands of fruits and vegetables.
So typically with the Right to Farm Act, you have that small component. So if you have a certain level of density, don't recall the number off the top of my head to quote, but it's so many dwelling units within like a 250 or 500-foot radius. And so if you exceed that, then local jurisdiction can clearly come in play, in which you can have local regulation. It's important to look in your charter or code of ordinances. Do you have separate requirements for beekeeping? Do you have separate requirements for keeping of chickens? It's not commonly only in your zoning ordinance. So check you don't have those other floating codes around that help regulate that when you have that level of density. But most of my communities, roadside stands are going to be pulled out separate as well, partly because with the Right to Farm Act changes, a farmer's market is considered the same thing as roadside stands. So several years ago they were different items and now they're the same. And so you can have a certain percentage that's off-site for a farmer's market as long as it's still that local context. And so that's why in a rule setting, you still want to keep those separate because you have different rules and regulations associated with the state to help provide clarification.
Okay. Ferndale, have you run into that? Anyone trying to do roadside stands?
No.
No.
Okay.
Lemonade stand maybe, but no. There's just not a lot of that going on here. We're very dense as a city, and there's just, I don't even know where somebody would put a roadside stand, honestly.
Okay. With regards to ticketing, do you find communities doing civil or criminal or a combination of both when they issue tickets? Are they civil or criminal?
So ours is civil.
Okay. Caitlin, you know?
Most of my communities keep the civil route as opposed to the criminal route.
Okay. Ryan, that's the last questions I see, so it's all yours.
Great. So thank you. I want to just thank Melissa, Caitlin, and Liz for presenting today. Great job. And I want to also thank all of our guests for joining us this morning. And also just a reminder, we have another upcoming planners gathering on August 5th for site design for emergency vehicles. So again, thanks for joining us today. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Thanks.